The room beneath the Tower of London did not echo with screams at first. It smelled of old iron, damp stone, and something else, something human, that had soaked into the walls over generations. In the center waited a machine designed not to kill quickly, but to stretch truth out of flesh. And standing before her was not a traitor, not a rebel, not an enemy soldier, but a young woman who had committed the most dangerous crime imaginable in Tudor England. She believed the wrong thing, and she refused to speak the names powerful men demanded. What followed was not an execution, but a process one hidden from history, one meant to break a body so completely that even silence would surrender. High officials of the realm would cross a line that even professional torturers refused to cross. And when the fire finally came, it would not erase what happened in that room. Because Anne Askew's story is not about death. It is about what power does when belief cannot be bought, when fear fails, and when a single woman's silence threatens a queen, a court, and the machinery of the state itself. The girl who read the wrong book, they thought her crime was a sentence whispered about bread and wine. But the real terror began when powerful men realized her silence could destroy a queen. And in Tudor England, truth wasn't punished. It was dismantled bone by bone. Anne Askew was born in 1521 in Lincolnshire, into the kind of household that produced obedient daughters, and loyal servants of the crown-warm rooms, polished silver, and a father whose name opened doors. Sir William Askew was a knight, a landowner, a man who knew how the kingdom worked, alliances, obedience, reputation. In that world, a girl's future was arranged like property marriage contracts, dowries and silence as a virtue. But Anne did something that made her dangerous long before anyone called her a heretic. She read with hunger. Not romances, not prayers chosen for women, but scripture itself, lines that men in power treated like locked weapons. England was changing, splitting, bleeding quietly behind velvet curtains. The king had broken from Rome, yet the old faith still had claws. New ideas moved like smoke through universities, through merchants' homes, through private chambers where candles were kept low and doors were barred. Anne learned those ideas early, and the frightening part wasn't that she believed differently, it was that she could explain it. She had the kind of mind that made priests uneasy, sharp, calm, unafraid to meet authority with questions. In a country where a wrong sentence could cost you your skin, she spoke like someone who had already accepted the price. Then her life was bent by an ordinary cruelty that revealed the true shape of the era. Anne had an older sister, meant to marry Thomas Kyme, a Catholic landowner. The wedding was politics with lace on top, family advantage, local power, tradition. But her sister died, and rather than mourn and withdraw, Sir William did something colder than grief. He substituted Anne in her place. The contract remained, so the girl would be exchanged. Anne was still young, forced into a house where her mind was treated like rebellion and her faith like infection. The marriage became a private battlefield. She refused to become the quiet wife the system demanded. She argued. She questioned. She spoke scripture back at men who expected her to lower her eyes. It wasn't merely defiance, it was a direct threat to the hierarchy that kept Tudor England stable. Because if one educated woman could challenge priests and husbands, what would stop others? Kyme's world was built on certainty, and Anne's presence was a crack in the wall. So, as the tension grew, she was pushed outcast away, separated from safety, from home, and eventually from the children history barely remembers. A woman alone in that time was not simply vulnerable. She was socially edible. And yet Anne walked into the danger instead of away from it. By the time she reached London, England's capital wasn't just a city, it was a listening machine. Walls heard things. Streets carried rumors like disease. The court sat nearby like a glowing furnace, and every ambitious man kept his hands near the heat. Anne moved through the legal district near the temple, seeking divorce, seeking freedom, but finding something far more lethal. a network of reform-minded believers who spoke carefully, met quietly, and understood that faith was now a political charge. Anne's belief about the Eucharist, whether bread became flesh, was not a simple doctrine dispute. Under the Act of 6 Articles, denying transubstantiation could kill you, and Anne denied it with logic sharp enough to embarrass trained theologians. That was the spark. The fire came from somewhere else. The court, conservative faction men like Stephen Gardiner and Thomas Wyatt-Thesley, who saw in Anne not merely a heretic, but a lever. If she knew names, if she could be forced to confess connections to ladies near Queen Catherine Parr, then her body could become a weapon aimed at the king's own marriage. That is how terror works in high places. Faith becomes an excuse, law becomes a costume, and a single woman becomes the door to a queen's execution. Anne did not know yet that she had already been chosen, not as a target, but as bait, and that the next summons would not be a debate with priests. It would be the first step down into stone. The woman who refused to be owned her sister's death should have ended one life. Instead, it erased Anne's right to choose her own. And from that quiet theft, a rebellion was born that no prison could contain. In Tudor England, a daughter was not asked where she wished to go. She was moved. When Anne Askew's older sister died before her arranged marriage, the household did not pause to grieve for long. The contract still existed, the alliance still mattered, and so Anne was placed where her sister had been meant to stand, as if grief had created an empty chair that needed to be filled. She was barely 15 when she was handed to Thomas Kyme, a man older, firmly Catholic, rooted in a world that demanded obedience from women and submission from wives. The marriage was not sealed by affection, but by expectation, and from the beginning Anne's presence felt like an error that refused to correct itself. She did not soften. She did not become smaller. She brought her books with her, her scripture, her questions, and in a house built on certainty, she became a constant disturbance. Kyme expected silence at the table. Anne answered priests. He expected reverence. She asked why. He expected faith to be inherited like land. She treated it as something tested by reason. In a society where a husband's authority was treated as divinely endorsed, her behavior was not merely disobedient, it was humiliating. What made her truly intolerable was not that she believed differently, but that she believed openly. Anne refused to abandon the name Askew, continuing to sign herself as her father's daughter rather than her husband's possession. It was a small act, almost invisible on paper, yet enormous in meaning. Names mattered, identity mattered, and every time she spoke scripture aloud or traveled to debate priests, she made it clear she did not see herself as a vessel for someone else's will. The marriage rotted quickly. Arguments became public. Whispers followed her through the parish. She left the house repeatedly, drawn to what was called gospeling, gatherings where scripture was read without permission, and doctrine was argued without fear. To Kyme and his clergy allies, this was not spiritual enthusiasm, it was contamination. Eventually, the decision was made for her. She was expelled, not legally divorced, not freed, simply pushed out and told to return to obedience she no longer recognized as legitimate. When she refused, the law sided with her husband. A woman could be commanded back into a marriage like livestock driven to pasture. Anne did not go. This was the moment her life crossed into open danger. A married woman separated from her husband, denied a divorce, cut off from protection, and yet unwilling to disappear into shame, such a figure unsettled the legal and religious order. Anne borrowed money from her brother and did something almost unthinkable. She hired a servant and went to London alone. London was not forgiving to women without male guardians. It swallowed them quietly, but Anne did not hide. She lived near the Temple, among lawyers and clerks, where arguments mattered and words carried weight. She sought legal redress, but she also continued to speak, to teach, to challenge. She stood in churches, and corrected priests. She quoted scripture better than they did. She answered questions with calm precision, never raising her voice, never begging for approval. This was not recklessness. It was conviction sharpened into steel. People began to notice her, not only fellow reformers, but watchers. In Tudor England, belief created records, words created trails, and trails led upward. Anne's belief about the sacrament, the bread that remained bread, became her signature, repeated by admirers and enemies alike. To some, she was fearless. To others, she was an infection spreading too close to power. Because London was not just a city of believers and doubters. It was a city built around the court. Every idea eventually drifted toward the palace, like smoke seeking air. And Anne's name began to move in circles where women close to the Queen were already under suspicion. What she did not yet understand was that her greatest danger was no longer her husband, or even the priests she embarrassed. It was the men who saw in her isolation an opportunity. A woman without protection was not just easy to arrest. She was easy to use. And somewhere behind stone walls and velvet curtains, a decision was forming that Anne Askew would no longer be debated. She would be tested. The network beneath the Crown London was full of prayers spoken softly and names never written down. Every candlelit meeting carried fear, greed, and betrayal in equal measure. And Anne Askew walked straight into the one place silence mattered most. By the time Anne Askew became a familiar figure in London's religious underground, the city itself had learned how to listen without speaking. Doors closed gently. Windows were shuttered early. Scripture was read in fragments, voices lowered not out of doubt, but out of survival. England was officially Protestant under the king, yet ruled by laws that could still burn you alive for believing the wrong version of truth. This contradiction created a secret world beneath the public one, a web of reformers, sympathizers, scholars, and court servants who believed change was possible, but understood it could only survive in shadows. Anne moved through this world with an unsettling calm. She did not whisper with panic or cloak herself in fear. She spoke carefully, yes, but without shame. Her belief was not defensive. It was deliberate. That confidence made people trust her, and that trust made her dangerous. In Tudor England, danger was not defined by violence. It was defined by influence. What Anne did not fully see was how close her footsteps were drifting to the palace itself. Queen Catherine Parr, the king's sixth wife, presided over a household unlike any before it. Educated, intellectually curious, quietly sympathetic to reform, Catherine had gathered around her women who read, discussed theology, and questioned doctrine with caution and intelligence. This did not make them revolutionaries, but it made them visible. Men like Stephen Gardner watched these women carefully, measuring conversations, weighing loyalties, waiting for weakness. Anne Askew's presence in London intersected with this world like a spark near dry wood. She knew women who knew the Queen. She shared beliefs with those protected only by proximity to royal favor. And she was alone, legally vulnerable, and already known for refusing to bend. To men who thought in strategy rather than conscience, Anne was not a problem. She was a solution. Her first arrest came quietly, without spectacle. No mob, no chains dragged through streets. She was examined by Bishop Edmund Bonner, questioned over days rather than hours, pressed on doctrine with the expectation that fear would loosen her tongue. But Anne treated the examination like a debate. She answered questions with questions. She quoted scripture precisely, forcing trained clergymen into awkward pauses. She never raised her voice. She never flinched. When pressed to explain her beliefs, she did so with logic so simple it felt like mockery. Bread molds, she said. Flesh does not. That sentence would follow her to the fire. Bonner released her on bail, frustrated but cautious. At this stage, Anne was still useful, alive, and free. She was sent back toward Lincolnshire with orders to return to her husband, orders she ignored without drama. This refusal hardened opinions against her. A woman who would not obey once could not be trusted to obey, ever. Behind the scenes, something darker was forming. Gardiner and his allies were not interested in Anne's soul. They were interested in leverage. England's court was divided by fear and greed, factions circling the king's illness, like wolves sensing weakness. To destroy the queen's influence, they needed proof names, connections, testimony that could not be dismissed as rumor. Anne was known. Anne was connected. Anne had already survived one examination without breaking. That made her both valuable and intolerable. When the Privy Council summoned her again, this time alongside her estranged husband, it was not reconciliation they sought. It was isolation. Kyme was dismissed. Anne was not. She was labeled dangerous, described dismissively as holding a naughty opinion, and sent to Newgate prison. The language was small. The intention was not. Newgate was designed to rot bodies before judgment ever arrived. Anne fell ill there, weakened, watched, and measured. And then she was moved. The transfer to the Tower of London was the moment her fate narrowed to a single corridor of stone. The Tower was not for ordinary heretics. It was for threats to the state. Once inside, Anne ceased to be a woman with beliefs and became a key to a locked door powerful men were desperate to open. They believed pain would do what reason could not. They believed fear would succeed where argument had failed. And beneath the White Tower, in chambers that smelled of iron and old suffering, the machine that ended debate was already waiting. The trap built for a queen. This was never about a woman's belief. It was about power circling a throne. Anne was not the prize. She was the blade meant to cut someone higher. And once the trap was set, mercy had no place inside it. By early 1546, England's court had become a place where fear moved faster than loyalty, and greed wore the mask of righteousness. King Henry VIII was dying slowly, his body swollen, his leg ulcer poisoning him with constant pain, his temper sharpening as his strength faded. In that unstable atmosphere, factions sharpened knives in silence. The conservative bloc, led by men like Stephen Gardiner and Thomas Wriothesley, understood something essential. If Queen Catherine Parr fell, everything could be reversed. Her influence restrained reform. Her survival protected Protestant sympathizers. Remove her, and the court would tilt back toward Catholic control. But attacking a queen required proof, not whispers. They needed evidence that her household was infected with heresy, and Anne Askew was the perfect instrument. She was known. She was isolated. She was already condemned in principle. All that remained was to make her speak. When Anne was brought before the Privy Council at Greenwich, the room was filled with men whose power shaped the nation. They questioned her relentlessly, not with shouting, but with pressure suggestions that cooperation would ease her fate, hints that silence would only worsen it. They demanded names. Anne gave none. She understood exactly what they wanted, and that understanding hardened her resolve. To speak was not merely to save herself. It was to destroy others. The Queen's ladies, the Queen herself. Anne chose silence, and in doing so, she sealed her own path. The council declared her stubborn, her opinions dangerous, her usefulness exhausted. She was sent back to prison, this time not as a misguided believer, but as a political liability. Newgate weakened her body. The Tower was meant to break her will. The Tower of London was not simply a prison, it was a statement. Stone walls that had watched nobles die, corridors that remembered treason, dungeons built to erase resistance. Anne was placed in conditions meant to strip her down to instinct. Cold cells, insufficient food, rough handling, isolation that stretched time into something thick and unbearable. Every day was designed to make pain feel inevitable. The men overseeing her confinement knew what was coming, and they prepared her for it, the way one prepares a structure for collapse. When she was finally summoned again, it was no longer for debate. It was for extraction. Sir Anthony Kingston, the constable of the tower, received orders that troubled even him. Torture was not routine. It required justification, authority, a sense that something vital to the realm was at stake. Anne's case was framed as exactly that. She knew secrets. She knew names. She was protecting traitors. Kingston was a man who had watched bodies fail under pressure and accepted it as duty. But this time the order carried a different weight. Anne was young. She was gentle-born. She had committed no violence. And yet the command was clear. Apply the rack until she revealed everything. The machine was prepared beneath the White Tower, in a chamber that smelled of damp iron and old terror. The rack was simple, brutally efficient, designed not to kill quickly, but to stretch truth out of flesh. Kingston resolved to do the minimum required, to give her every chance to speak before increasing the strain. It was the bargain he made with himself, the line he believed still separated duty from cruelty. Anne was brought down barefoot, dressed only in a thin shift, her body already weakened. She looked at the rack without panic, studying it as if understanding was a form of armor. When asked again for names, she refused. The wheels turned. Pain spread through her body with mechanical certainty. Joints strained, breath shortened. Still she said nothing. Kingston watched, measured, and stopped when he believed no more could be demanded. It was not enough. Wriothesley wanted results, not restraint. When Kingston refused to continue, something unprecedented happened. Authority stepped past professionalism and into naked brutality. The Lord Chancellor himself approached the machine. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. He placed his hands on the wheel and turned it. He turned it again. Anne's body, already damaged, was pulled further apart by a man whose role was supposed to represent law, not savagery. Another official assisted him. This was no longer interrogation. It was punishment disguised as necessity. When they finally stopped, Anne could not stand. She could not walk. Her body was broken in ways that would never heal. And yet, when Wriothesley sat beside her on the stone floor and spoke softly, offering theology where violence had failed, she answered him. She argued doctrine from the ground, refusing to recant even as pain consumed her. They carried her away in a chair, because there was no other way to move her. The trap had failed to spring as intended. No names were given. No queen was touched. But Anne Askew's body had been destroyed, and the men who ordered it were not finished. The fire still waited. Kept alive for the fire. They did not stop because mercy found them. They stopped because a broken body was still needed. And death, carefully delayed, became part of the ritual. After the rack was finally silenced, Anne Askew did not return to a cell in the tower. She could not. Her body no longer functioned in the way a body was expected to. Her shoulders were destroyed, her joints torn apart, her muscles ruined by a machine designed to erase resistance without killing outright. She lay unable to move, her breath shallow, pain constant and consuming. Yet the men who had ordered her torture did not allow her to die. That would have been wasteful. Execution required a living body. A public lesson demanded a conscious victim. So Anne was removed from the tower and taken to a private house, not as an act of kindness, but as preparation. She was fed. She was kept warm, just enough. The same hands that had torn her apart now ensured she survived long enough to burn. This was the logic of power at its most naked. Preserve life only to destroy it properly. During this period, Anne was given what her captors called opportunity. They visited her bed of pain and spoke of mercy, of forgiveness, of recantation. They framed surrender as wisdom, as humility, as escape. All she had to do was speak the words they wanted, acknowledge that the bread was flesh, that the doctrine she rejected was true. After everything they had done to her body, after the rack, after the humiliation of being carried like an object, they still believed pain would eventually purchase obedience. They misunderstood the nature of what they were facing. Anne had already accepted death. That acceptance freed her in a way no threat could touch. She refused again, quietly, without drama. Her belief did not flare or weaken. It simply remained. Confined to her bed, unable to lift her arms properly, Anne did something that should not have been possible. She wrote. With shattered joints and constant agony, she composed an account of her interrogations and torture. Not a scream set to paper, not a confused confession, but a precise, structured narrative. She recorded names, conversations, arguments, procedures. She wrote with clarity that stripped the violence of any excuse. These writings were smuggled out and copied by sympathetic hands. In doing so, Anne transformed her own suffering into evidence. The men who had believed themselves untouchable suddenly faced the possibility that history might remember them not as guardians of order, but as butchers wearing office. This frightened them more than heresy ever had. They attempted to suppress the documents, to discredit the accounts, but the damage was already done. Truth had escaped the walls. Meanwhile, the political consequences of Anne's silence began to surface. The conservative faction's plot against Queen Catherine Parr stalled. Without names, without testimony tying the Queen's ladies directly to heresy, they had nothing solid to present to the king. Catherine, warned of danger, approached Henry with calculated humility, presenting herself not as a thinker, but as a student eager to learn from his superior wisdom. The king accepted this posture, and the immediate threat passed. The Queen survived. Anne's body had paid the price for that survival, though Anne herself would never benefit from it. Her usefulness was over. Her execution date was set. On the morning chosen for her death, Anne could not walk. She could not even stand. The damage inflicted on the rack had made sure of that. She was carried to Smithfield in a chair, a detail that shocked even hardened observers. Chains were prepared not because she might resist, but because her body could no longer support itself. A bag of gunpowder was tied around her neck, a grim mercy meant to hasten death once the flames reached her. Around her, the crowd gathered, drawn by fear, curiosity, and the promise of spectacle. Executions were theater in Tudor England, rituals meant to reinforce obedience through terror. Anne, bound and broken, was the centerpiece. As the fire was prepared beneath her, one last offer was made. One last chance to speak the words that would save her life. She refused. Witnesses recorded that her face did not show panic. It showed resolve. She spoke of faith, of endurance, of truth that could not be burned away. When the flames rose, they consumed wood and flesh alike, and the gunpowder ignited, ending her life quickly. The crowd watched in silence that lingered long after the fire died down. What they had seen was not merely an execution. It was the destruction of a woman whose body had been broken long before the stake, whose silence had defeated men more powerful than any fire. And as the smoke drifted upward, England quietly absorbed a truth it would never fully confront, that the state had needed to torture a woman nearly to death just to fail. What the fire could not erase, the flames were meant to end the story. Instead, they exposed something darker than heresy. Because long after the body was gone, the silence kept speaking. Anne Askew's execution was supposed to be closure. The authorities believed fire solved problems permanently. A public death erased dangerous ideas, restored order, and reminded the living of their place. Smithfield had seen many burnings before, and the ritual followed a familiar pattern. The condemned displayed, the crowd gathered, the lesson delivered through heat and terror. But something went wrong in the way the crowd watched Anne. She did not scream as expected. She did not bargain at the edge of the flames. Bound to the stake because she could not stand, her body already destroyed by the rack, she looked less like a criminal and more like evidence. People had come to witness punishment. Instead, they witnessed the aftermath of something that should not have happened. The chair, the chains, the gunpowder at her neck. These details told a story the authorities could not control. This woman had not been broken by fire. She had been broken earlier, in secret, by men who claimed to act in the name of law. After her death, the machinery that had destroyed Anne Askew moved on quickly. Henry VIII died within months, his reign ending not with clarity but exhaustion. Catherine Parr survived him, remarried, and lived just long enough to escape the court that had nearly consumed her. Stephen Gardiner fell in and out of favor as England lurched through religious reversals. Thomas Wriothesley died quietly, his hands clean in public memory, his actions buried in archives few would read. This is how power protects itself, not by denying what it did, but by allowing time to blur it. Anne had no tomb of consequence, no monument raised by the state. She had words, and those words refused to stay buried. Her writings circulated among reformers, copied and preserved with care. They were read not as propaganda alone, but as testimony. A woman's voice describing her own torture in clear, controlled language unsettled readers more than exaggerated horror ever could. There was no hysteria in her account, no theatrical self-pity, just procedure, pain, and refusal. Historians later would argue about bias, about Protestant framing, about motive. But even critics could not deny one fact. No one involved ever seriously disputed that she was racked. No one denied that high officials turned the machine themselves. They objected not to accuracy, but to exposure. Anne Askew had done something rare. She had forced the state to be seen. What makes her story linger is not simply the brutality inflicted on her body. Tudor England was full of brutality. What haunts history is the reason it was done. Anne was tortured not to stop violence, not to prevent rebellion, not to save lives. She was tortured because she would not betray others, because she refused to convert belief into currency, because silence, in that moment, threatened men whose power depended on obedience flowing downward without resistance. The rack was not used to extract truth. It was used to manufacture fear. And it failed. In the centuries that followed, Anne Askew was remembered as a martyr, a symbol of faith under persecution. That label is neat, comfortable. It allows the story to end with virtue rewarded in memory. But the darker lesson lies elsewhere. Her story reveals how easily law becomes ritual, how quickly procedure becomes cruelty when ambition demands it. It shows how institutions justify anything once they decide a body is expendable. Anne was not unique in her suffering. She was unique in her refusal to make suffering useful to power. The Tower of London still stands. Tourists walk its corridors, admire its walls, photograph its stones. Beneath those stones are chambers where pain was once applied with calm professionalism, where men convinced themselves they were doing necessary work. Anne Askew's story reminds us that the most terrifying executions are not the ones done in public, but the ones prepared in private. The fire was the final act, but the real execution happened earlier, in a room that smelled of iron. An old fear, when a woman realized that nothing she said could save her and chose silence anyway. That choice is what survives, not the flames, not the men. Silence held under unbearable pressure became the loudest thing in the room.